All right, we're here with Terre Gales running for the open Anchorage Assembly seat in East Anchorage. Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Of course. Go ahead and just tell me a little bit about yourself.
Well, I got to Alaska by way of the Air Force. I was a security forces member in the Air Force. I'm married. I have 3 children and 1 on the way. Excited about that.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I have a 15-year-old nephew who lives with me as well. We bought our home in East Anchorage, right off Northern Lights on Campbell Airstrip, and I got kids in the school district, and I'm really excited right now and pumped up about this election, and just getting used to all of this because this is very new for me. This is the most uncomfortable experience I've ever had, and I've been to Iraq, so that felt more comfortable to me than this. So.
Well, that brings me to my next question. Why are you running to be on the Anchorage Assembly?
I've always been about community. I've always been about giving back. I grew up in a home with a single mother, and we grew up in a neighborhood where rolling from the bed to the floor in the middle of the night because you hear gunshots was normal. Drugs being dealt in the middle of the day was normal. And so growing up in that type of environment, one of the things that I've grown to see that was important is any opportunity you can to give hope, to give back to the community and say, hey, though life hasn't always been fair to me, it has been good to me. And so I just want to give back. I mean, I sat down and talked to my wife about it, my kids about it, and we thought this was a great opportunity to do that.
All right, and so if voters choose to elect you on April 5th, what will be your first priority?
I'm a co-sponsor of Proposition 8, which is to restore the tax cap to the way it had been for 30 years, and it worked really well. So my biggest priority right now is in these hard economic times where people are being laid off from work, is to protect the taxpayers and protect the people in the community. With our state in the financial crisis that we're in, the thought that I have neighbors who have lost jobs, and the first thing that the government wants to do is create new taxes or raise the current taxes that we have. So my main priority right now is to ensure that each individual living in East Anchorage has an opportunity to still pursue that American dream.
All right, and so how can you help the muni with the current budget issues we're facing?
When it comes to budgets, we hear all of us talking about it and what we should do and should not do. It's hard to say until you really look at it. And I don't want to be one of those people that make all these claims and then you get in there and you find that the story's not exactly what you thought it was. So the first thing I'm going to do is look at it. You really have to look at each department, where the money is going in each department, decide what you really need and what you don't need, take out the things you don't need, and that'll free up some of that cash to put toward the police department because we do need more officers.
Okay. Just right off the bat, when you talk about making cuts, do you know if there's any departments offhand or things that you think that could be changed, cut, we could do without?
Right. Well, I look at the school district, and they have carpentry shops with, very expensive equipment, a ton of inventory. They have 2 carpentry shops within 15 minutes ride of each other. That just seems a little odd to me. It doesn't seem to make sense. So that's one thing we can look at. And I'm sure if they're doing that with carpentry shops, they could be doing that with anything else. So we want to look at things like that. We could probably also consolidate some of the municipal job duties. Facility maintenance that works for the municipality. Why does there need to be a different facility maintenance for the school district? So if we looked at consolidating some of those things, that would probably save money as well.
All right, and then when we talk about taxes, what are your thoughts on diversifying Anchorage's tax base? Right now, property owners are doing all the heavy lifting.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I realize when I knock on doors and I'm talking to folks, and you mentioned that, okay, what if we did a sales tax? And they say, well, will it reduce the tax cap and reduce the burden on the taxpayers? I say, well, that's the intent. That's what most of us would like to happen. But then there's the fear that once we have them both, because you'll have to have both for a time, that it won't ever change, that we won't go back, or we will go back on our word. So the first thing that needs to happen is we need to restore that trust in our officials by going through that budget, making the proper changes and choices and decisions, and doing what we say we're going to do. So once we do that, then we could earn the public trust and put it back to the voters to make a decision if we want to do that.
And then you've already touched on the tax cap calculation.
Yes.
If you just want to go more in depth here, why do you oppose the changes the Assembly made most recently, changing the way we calculate our tax cap?
Well, what it has done is after they made that change, that kind of loophole, they immediately raised taxes. Immediately, that was the decision that was made. And so with the tough economic times, this is not the time to raise taxes. When we think of the tax cap, people mostly think of property owners, but you also have vehicle registration, boat registration, all the other things and the toys that people kind of buy and some of the other things. But property taxes are impacted the most. So when you raise property taxes on residential areas, it's also going to be raised on businesses. So our grocery stores, our clothing stores, our small businesses. So everyone is affected across the board. And when having worked in retail as an area manager, one of the things I know is when there's extra expenses or added expenses to our profit and loss statements, we pass that back on to the consumer. So the effects are ever reaching. It's not just about property owners, it's about everybody.
All right, and then let's talk about public safety. Obviously, there's a lot of talk about our police force.
Yes.
Is it strong enough? Is it working efficiently? What would you do to make Anchorage a safer place to live?
Absolutely. You know, I have the luxury, or kind of luxury, I guess, of having been a police officer. But I've also been on the other side. You know, I've lived in bad neighborhoods where there wasn't a lot of trust in the police. You know, I've felt harassed by police at many times in my life. But then I became a police officer. And so I have the experience of both of those worlds. So one of the big things we need to do is restore trust in our police departments. You know, when I was in field training, I was taken to a neighborhood by my field training officer. And he said, let's get out the car and let's walk. I said, walk? I don't want to walk. He said, you know, you've got to get to know the people that live in the community that you patrol. You know, we had that incident where there was a shooting and people were shot. Police went to the hospital to talk to them. They wouldn't even talk to them. I mean, that says something. There has to be trust and faith in the police. But having been an officer, I do understand that we are short-staffed, so we need more officers. I believe very strongly in community policing. And in order to have that, we have to have enough officers on the street to allow officers to communicate with the people in the communities that they live. Because policing is not just something done by the police, it's done by the community as well. It's a very strong partnership that has to be created. And I think that's the way to do it. And
then let's talk about our homeless population. The mayor has been pushing housing first. How do you think the muni can deal with Anchorage's homeless population?
You know, once again, I have been homeless. As a youth, I was homeless. In fact, I remember going to a relative's house, standing on their doorstep with my mother, asking, hey, can we stay with you? They said no. She said, well, can Therese stay with you? And she said no. And then we left. So I understand the effects of homelessness. I understand how horrible that is. You know, but what I'm learning and by walking and knocking on doors and even interacting with some of the homeless population, and my wife and children and I sometimes go out and give out food over by Beans Cafe. Many of these individuals have other issues. So we could look at substance abuse. We could look at mental issues and everything like that. So, you know, my father's a drug addict and has been my entire life. And one thing I know about my dad is no matter where he is at, whether he's in a house or a car or outside, he's still going to do what he's doing. So I understand the concept of housing first. And I commend people for wanting to do that. Number one, it has to be paid for, and who's going to pay for it? Once again, we're looking at the working class that's going to have to pay for that. But also, you can't change what's in here on anyone. You place someone inside of a house, that doesn't mean that they're going to just instantly stop doing everything they were doing before. And it also doesn't mean that they're going to stay in the house. I mean, we're going to force them to stay inside. And having been a cop and dealing with certain populations like that, many of the people enjoy the freedom. They don't like the four walls, and they enjoy the freedom. So I don't know that the housing first option is how it's going to work, because that is not going to change what's inside a person.
All right, and then another housing question for you. Anchorage faces a shortage of housing and a population that is projected to grow. How can we prepare for that?
You know, one of the things we could do is make the permitting process a little bit easier so that we can build houses. In order to place people in houses or give people an opportunity to live somewhere, there have to be houses built in some situations. So that's the first thing we need to do, because the longer it takes to get a building built, so you know, you start building a house, you take the permit in, you got to go through code and all these different things, right? And if it gets held up because there's either a code enforcer's personal interpretation of what it says, it's going to cost more money, and the builders are paying every day. So the longer that process takes, the more the cost to build the house is going to be, and they're going to pass that cost right back on to the consumer. So we can create affordable housing and more housing. We just have to clean that process up a little bit more. And it's not the people, it's really the process that's the problem. And Title 21, you know, they're trying to fix little issues with it right now. It's been a long process for that. So we clean up that process, I think it'll make things a lot easier.
All right, and then this summer we will watch a brand new industry, you know, try to open up here in Anchorage. How do you think the muni should be regulating commercial marijuana?
Well, we have a few examples: tobacco, cigarettes. We have some of the more adult entertainment that we place in different parts of the community to keep it out of neighborhoods and protect our children. So we need to look at those examples and kind of monitor it and alter it based on that. We should build it based on that. What we don't need to do is to discriminate. You know, having been a police officer, having a father that's a drug addict and growing up in community like that, I'm not a big fan of marijuana. I'm not going to use it. I don't think anyone should use it. But the voters have spoken, and they said they believe that people should have the right to use it. So that being said, we can't discriminate on the business. We have to be fair in our decisions on how we decide to regulate that industry.
All right, and then the Anchorage School District wants to ask voters to approve bonds over the next 6 years, knowing that taxpayers will likely be paying for all of it. Is that something you support?
No, I don't. In fact, the last time we went through this prior, the state said, hey, we're not going to have the money for this. And we still put that on, and the school district still sold it as we're going to get the money reimbursed by the state, and it didn't happen. And when you look at the League of Women Voters, they put out that nice pamphlet that goes to everyone, so thank you to them for that. But you notice that none of the operation or maintenance costs were shown for almost no bonds in that thing. And we need to educate the voters before we ask them to spend more of their hard-earned money on anything. So let's first start by educating the voters on the real cost of these items, and we can go from there. But I'm not in favor of all these school bonds without fixing our budget issues.
For sure. All right, and then last question for you. How would you rate the mayor's performance so far? What grade would you give him?
That's a tough question. You know, it's a really tough time. And I see the logic in many things that he's doing. One of the things I will say is it's nice to see someone who has a heart for people. And that is very obvious. But what I don't want to get lost in that is the working class. You know, we bear the brunt of every policy, every law, every regulation, and every tax. So, you know, I guess I could say we could give him a B.
All right.
You know, I think he's doing a fair job with what he's trying to do. I just really want to make sure that we're not overtaxed.
Gotcha. All right, Terre Gales, East Anchorage. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time.